The night Adaeze Okafor lost everything, the rain came down like it had somewhere to be. Not the soft kind of rain that makes people in movies look beautiful and tragic. The hard, indifferent kind. The kind that soaks through a coat in 40 seconds and turns cardboard into nothing, and makes the gap between having shelter and not having it feel like the distance between two entirely different worlds. She knew that gap now. She was standing in the middle of it, on the corner of Amsterdam Avenue and 143rd Street in Harlem, New York, at 11:17 on a Thursday night in November, with a single duffel bag at her feet and nowhere in the world to go. 6 hours ago, she had been inside. 6 hours ago, she had been in the apartment she had shared with her cousin Blessing for 14 months. The apartment that had been tight and sometimes tense, but had been warm and had been hers, until Blessing's boyfriend decided he was moving in and Adaeze was moving out, and the conversation that followed had been brief and final and had left her standing on the sidewalk with everything she owned in one bag before she fully processed what was happening. She was 24 years old. She had $211 in her checking account. She had a phone with 31% battery. She had a coat that was already soaked through and a pair of boots with a slow leak in the left one. She had a degree in social work from CUNY that she had finished 8 months ago, and a job at a nonprofit in the Bronx that paid $26,000 a year, and that she loved with the specific passion of someone who had chosen their work from the inside out. Not because it was practical, but because it was the only thing she had ever wanted to do. She also had, as of tonight, no address to put on a form. This is where most stories like this begin with a spiral, with the slow erosion of options, each door closing slightly faster than the last. Adaeze knew those stories. She had worked with people inside them. She knew every station of that particular journey. What she did not know, standing on that corner in the November rain with 31% battery and soaked boots and the particular hollow sensation of a person who has just had the ground removed from under them without warning, was that the next 30 minutes were going to introduce a variable that changed the architecture of the situation entirely. She did not know yet that a black car was going to stop at the light on the corner of Amsterdam and 143rd. She did not know that the man in the back seat was going to look out the window at exactly the right moment. And she did not know that Park Il-sung, 40 years old, the kind of still that came from having survived things that would have unmade most people, with dark eyes that missed nothing and a reputation in certain circles of this city that made careful men speak carefully, was going to make a decision in the space of 4 seconds that would cost him nothing and cost her nothing and change everything anyway. Stay with me, because this is the part where everything starts, and it is not going to go the way you think. By the time the black car stopped at the light, Adaeze had been standing on that corner for 11 minutes. She had already tried 3 things. She had called her friend Chiamaka, who lived in the Bronx and had a studio apartment with 1 bed, and whose phone had gone straight to voicemail. She had looked up emergency shelter availability on her phone and found 2 options, both in Midtown, both with waitlists that operated on a first-come basis that meant arriving before 8 p.m., which she had not done. She had considered calling her supervisor at the nonprofit, a woman named Dorothy Reyes, who was genuinely decent and who Adaeze was almost certain would find a solution if asked. And she had not called because calling your supervisor at 11 p.m. to say you had just become homeless felt, in that moment, like the kind of thing that once said could not be unsaid, and she was not ready yet for the specific vulnerability of that. She was standing with her back against the building, partially sheltered by a narrow awning that was doing almost nothing, and she was thinking very carefully and methodically about her options because thinking carefully and methodically was what she did when things got bad. It was a habit from childhood. Her mother, a nurse from Enugu who had come to America at 27 with $200 and a suitcase and had spent 30 years building a life from the ground up, had told her once that panic was a luxury and clarity was a skill, and that the difference between the two was practice. Adaeze had practiced. So she was thinking. She was not panicking. She was simply working through the problem with the available information. The light at the corner turned red. A black car stopped. She registered it peripherally and went back to her options. The window came down. She looked up. A man in the back seat was looking at her. Not the way men sometimes looked at women standing alone at night, which she had been tracking and deciding she was not concerned about. This was different. It was a direct look, clear and without agenda that she could immediately identify, with something in it that she had learned to recognize in her work. The look of someone taking stock of a situation with the intent to address it rather than to simply observe it. He said, through the open window, in English with a slight Korean accent, "Are you all right?" She looked at him for a moment. She was a trained social worker. She had spent 3 years learning to read people, and then 8 months practicing that reading in the field. She assessed him rapidly. Mid-40s, Korean, sharp-featured, wearing what was visible of a dark coat over a dark shirt. No immediate indicators of threat. Eyes that were direct without being aggressive. The car was expensive. The question was simple, and it had been asked without the particular edge of someone looking for something. She said, "I'm fine." He said, "You've been standing in the rain for at least 10 minutes. She didn't ask how he knew that. She said, "I'm figuring something out." He looked at her for 2 more seconds. Then he said, "There's a diner 2 blocks north. Sits open all night. You can wait there and figure it out in the dry." She looked at him. Then she said, "I know the diner." He nodded once. The light changed. The car moved. She watched it go. She stood on the corner for 30 more seconds. Then she picked up her duffel bag and walked 2 blocks north. The diner was called Helen's, and it had been on that block for 31 years, and it smelled like coffee and griddle oil, and the specific warmth of a room that had absorbed a great quantity of human presence over a long period of time. Adaze had been in it twice before. She sat down in a booth near the back, ordered a coffee because she needed something warm and coffee was $3, and she put her phone on the table and looked at it and thought about who to call. She was on her second coffee when the door opened and the man from the car walked in. She registered him immediately. Same dark coat. Taller than she had estimated from the car window. The tattoos at his neck. Dark lines. Precise. The kind that continued somewhere below the collar. He looked around the diner, found her booth, and walked toward it without hesitation. She watched him come with the focused calm of someone who had already decided how they were going to handle whatever this was. He stopped at the edge of the booth. He said, "I'm going to ask you directly. Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Why?" "Because you were standing in the rain with one bag and you said you were figuring something out. Those 2 things together usually mean no." She absorbed that. He was not wrong. She was trained to make exactly that kind of assessment, and he had made it correctly in under a minute from a moving car. She noted that. "No," she said. "Not tonight." He slid into the booth across from her. She didn't ask him to, and she didn't object. He did it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone addressing a practical problem. "Tell me what happened," he said. She looked at him. "I don't know you." "No," he said. "You don't. You can tell me anyway or you don't have to. But I'm going to try to help either way so the information would be useful." She looked at him for a long moment. Her assessment continued. Everything she was reading said the same thing. Direct, practical, no performance. She had learned in her work that the people who helped the way they helped because they needed to be seen helping looked different from this. They leaned forward. They used softer voices. They reflected your expressions back at you. This man was doing none of those things. He was simply present and waiting, and entirely prepared to sit here until the situation was addressed. She told him. It took 4 minutes. She kept it factual because factual was her default, and because she did not know him, and because she had enough professional training to know that you gave the information relevant to the problem, and not the information relevant to the feelings about the problem, which was something she would deal with separately and later. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Is there anyone in the city you can call tonight?" She said, "My friend isn't answering. My supervisor, maybe. I haven't called her yet." "Call her," he said. She looked at him. "It's almost midnight." "She'd want to know," he said. Adaze looked at her phone. She thought about Dorothy Reyes, who had worked in social services for 22 years, and who had seen everything, and who had told Adaze on her first day that the work was about showing up for people in the exact moment they needed it, and that the only wrong move was not showing up. She thought about the fact that she was a person right now who needed someone to show up. She called Dorothy. Dorothy answered on the third ring. Adiz told her factually what had happened. Dorothy said 3 words, "I'm coming, baby," and hung up. She put the phone down. The man across from her was looking at her with an expression that was not pity and not satisfaction, and not the particular warmth people performed when they wanted credit for being decent. It was simply acknowledgement. She had done the right thing, and he was noting it. "What's your name?" he said. "Adiazi," she said. He said it back correctly. All 4 syllables, without hesitation. Adiazi. She noted that too. Most people contracted it or approximated it. He produced it accurately on the first attempt, which meant he had either worked with Nigerian names before, or he was precise enough about language to get it right without practice. Il-sung, he said. Park Il-sung. She had heard that name before, not in her personal life, in the context of her work. The nonprofit she worked for operated in neighborhoods where the geography of power was not always the geography that appeared on official maps, and she had been there long enough to understand the difference. She had heard Park Il-sung's name mentioned twice, both times in passing, both times by people who mentioned it the way you mention a weather system. Present. Significant. Something you took into account. She looked at him across the table. She said, "I know who you are." He looked back. He said, "All right." She said, "That doesn't change anything about tonight, but I want you to know that I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's fair." The diner moved around them. The coffee was warm. Outside the window, the rain had not stopped. Adiz sat across from a man whose world was nothing like her world, and looked at the situation with the same clarity she brought to everything, and decided that tonight was not the night for everything. Tonight was the night for the immediate problem, which was shelter, which was being addressed, and for keeping the information she had filed in the appropriate place until she understood what to do with it. Dorothy arrived at 12:37. She was a black woman in her early 50s, natural gray locks, wearing a winter coat she had clearly grabbed without thinking over what looked like pajamas, and she walked into Helen's diner with the energy of someone who had not needed to be asked twice and was not going to start now. She looked at Adiz and then at the man across the table. Adiz said, "Dorothy, this is Il-sung." He stopped and made sure I came inside. Dorothy looked at Il-sung for a moment with the precise assessment of a woman who had spent 22 years working in communities where reading people correctly was a professional requirement. Then she said, "Thank you for that." She turned to Adiz. "You're coming home with me tonight and we're going to figure out the rest in the morning." Adiz said, "Dorothy, I don't want to..." Dorothy said, "Adiz, it's not a conversation." Adiz was quiet. Then she said, "Okay." She stood and picked up her bag. She looked at Il-sung. He was watching her with that expression that she had decided was simply how he looked at things he was paying attention to. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You handled it well." She said, "I had help." He nodded. He looked at Dorothy and gave a single nod of acknowledgement. Dorothy returned it with the specific efficiency of 2 people who understood each other without ceremony. Adiz walked out of Helen's diner into the November rain that was still coming down, and followed Dorothy to her car and got in and sat in the passenger seat while Dorothy started the engine, and the heater came on, and the warmth of it hit her face, and she felt, for the first time since she had been standing on that corner, something loosen in her chest. Dorothy drove. She didn't ask questions. She put on the radio quietly, something older, something with a melody that moved through the car like a hand on a shoulder. And she drove north through the wet Harlem streets and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Who is he?" Adiz looked out the window. "Someone who stopped at a light," she said. Dorothy said, "Mm-hmm." Adiz said nothing. Dorothy said, "He's the kind of man people know the name of." Adiz said, "I know." Dorothy drove for another block. Then she said, "You know what I always tell you about the work?" Adiz said, "Show up for people in the moment they need it." "That's right," Dorothy said. Doesn't only apply in one direction. Adaze looked at her. Dorothy was watching the road. She thought about that for the rest of the drive. Dorothy's apartment was in Washington Heights, clean and warm and full of the particular order of a person who had made their home a deliberate thing. There was a guest room. Dorothy made up the bed without discussion, put a towel on the chair, and said, "Sleep. Everything else is morning." Adaze slept. She woke at 7:42 to the smell of coffee and eggs and the sound of Dorothy on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in the low, efficient voice of someone organizing things. She lay in the guest bed for a moment and looked at the ceiling and did what she always did in the morning. She took stock. She was in a warm room. She had slept. She had a job. She had Dorothy. She had $211 in a duffel bag and a problem to solve, but she had all the basic materials of a person who could solve a problem. She got up. Dorothy had already started making calls. A colleague who knew someone who had a room. A community organization that kept a list of short-term housing resources. A contact at a building in Inwood that had a studio opening at the end of the month. By 9 a.m., Adaze had 3 options written on a notepad in Dorothy's kitchen and a cup of coffee in her hand, and the particular feeling of a problem that had been genuinely serious and was now being genuinely addressed. She did not think about Il-sung for most of that morning. She was focused on the practical architecture of the next 2 weeks. She thought about him once, briefly, when Dorothy said over breakfast, "The man from last night." That was a kind thing he did. Adaze said, "Yes." Dorothy said, "People like that don't usually stop." "No," Adaze agreed. "They don't." That was all she said about it. She went to work that afternoon, told her colleague James that she was between places temporarily and was fine, handled her caseload with the same attention she brought to it every day, came back to Dorothy's and made dinner, and sat with Dorothy, and watched a documentary about migratory birds that Dorothy had been meaning to watch for 3 months. She did not hear from Il-sung. She had not expected to. The room in Inwood came available in 12 days. It was small, and the heat was inconsistent, and the building super was a man named Gerald, who communicated primarily through notes slipped under doors, but it was hers, and it was within her budget, and it was on the 3rd floor of a building that had good locks and neighbors she assessed, from the first week, as decent. She moved in on a Saturday with Dorothy's help and 2 colleagues from the nonprofit, and a borrowed truck, and she had it furnished and organized by nightfall, which was one of the things she was good at, making a space work with what was there. On the Monday of her 3rd week in the new apartment, she arrived at the nonprofit to find a message waiting for her with the building's receptionist. A card, plain white, no logo, her name written by hand on the outside. Inside, a single line. There's a position open at the Park Foundation. Community Housing Initiatives, Harlem and Washington Heights. If you're interested, call this number. She read it twice. She set it on her desk. She went through her morning and handled her cases and ate her lunch at her desk, and thought about the card the way she thought about everything that required thinking, which was from all angles and without rushing any of them. The Park Foundation. She looked it up carefully. A private foundation, registered and legitimate, operating for 6 years, with a documented focus on community housing, youth services, and economic development in Upper Manhattan. Annual grants totaling approximately $4 million. Board members whose names she researched individually. All checkable. All checked. The foundation's director of community programs, according to the public record, was a woman named Grace Yoon, who had 30 years of social services experience and 3 published papers in the field that Adaze had, as it turned out, read. 2 years ago, she had read one of them in a graduate seminar and had thought it was one of the clearest pieces of writing about community-based housing intervention she had encountered. She picked up the card. She called the number. Grace Yoon answered. She had a voice like someone who had been having direct conversations for 30 years and had developed an efficiency for them. She said, "Ms. Okafor, thank you for calling. I understand you're in community housing case management currently. I'd like to talk to you about what we're building." Adaze said, "I'd like to hear about it." The conversation lasted 40 minutes. The position was real. The salary was 41% higher than what she was currently making. The scope was larger, Not individual case management, but program development, working with community organizations across 6 neighborhoods to design and implement housing stability interventions at scale. It was, she thought honestly, the kind of work she had been building towards since her first year at QNY. The kind of work that existed 3 or 4 steps ahead of where she currently was. She said, "I'd want to meet in person before I make any decisions." Grace said, "Of course. Thursday at 10? She said yes. She hung up. She sat at her desk for a moment and looked at the card and thought about a man who had asked 2 direct questions from the window of a car and then walked into a diner and told her to call her supervisor. She thought about what it meant that this was happening. She thought about it carefully and honestly, the way she thought about everything. She did not think it was nothing, but she also did not think it was everything. It was something, and the something required understanding before it required anything else. She went to the interview on Thursday. Grace Yoon was exactly what the papers had suggested. Direct, substantive, someone who talked about the work because she meant it, and not because she wanted anything from the conversation other than the truth of whether this was the right match. The offices were clean and organized, and the staff she passed in the corridor had the specific energy of people who were busy doing something real. She met Il-sung in the corridor as she was leaving. He was coming from the opposite direction, clearly on his way somewhere, with a man she didn't recognize beside him. He stopped when he saw her. The man with him continued a few steps before noticing and stopping too. She looked at him. He looked at her. The corridor was quiet. "How are you?" he said. "Good," she said. She held up the notepad she was carrying from the interview briefly. "The interview went well." He nodded. "Good." She said, "You could have told me it was your foundation when you left the card." He said, "I didn't leave the card." Grace did. "I told her you might be worth talking to." She absorbed that. "And the distinction matters to you?" "Yes," he said. "It does." She looked at him. The corridor was still quiet. His associate was standing a respectful distance away with the expression of someone who had learned when to not be part of a conversation. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you need to make the decision about the job on its own merits, not because you feel like you owe me something for a night in the rain." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a careful distinction." "It's the correct one," he said. She looked at him. She thought about her mother who had come to America at 27 with $200 in a suitcase and had built a life on the principle that you accepted help where it was offered and gave it where you could and kept clear accounts in between. She thought about Dorothy, who had shown up because that was what the work required, in every direction. She thought about the architecture of the situation, the layers of it, what was showing and what was below the waterline. She said, "I'm going to take the job if they offer it." He said, "That's your decision to make." She said, "I know, but I'm telling you." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad the room worked out." She said, "How do you know about the room?" He said, "Harlem is smaller than it looks." She almost smiled. She contained it. She said, "Thank you, for the diner, for being direct, for the distinction." He said, "You handled all of it. I just stopped at a red light." She said, "You chose to stop at a red light in that particular way." He was quiet. Then he said, "Fair." She nodded. He nodded. His associate appeared at his shoulder with the quiet efficiency of someone managing a schedule, and Il-sung looked at him briefly and then back at her. He said, "I hope the work is what you want it to be." She said, "It will be. I'll make sure of it." She walked down the corridor and out of the building into the upper Manhattan afternoon, which was cold and clear and entirely different from the night it had started. She walked 2 blocks to the subway and went down the stairs and stood on the platform and felt the particular quality of her own life in that moment, the specific weight of something that had shifted. She was still the same person who had stood on a corner in the rain with 31% battery and a slow leak in her left boot and nowhere to go. That hadn't been erased. It had happened and it had been real, and she had stood in the middle of it and thought clearly and made the right calls and come through it. She had also been stopped at a red light by a man who had chosen, in 4 seconds, to be decent. And that had mattered. She was honest enough to know it had mattered. The train came. She got on. She found a seat and looked at the passing dark of the tunnel and thought about the work ahead of her, the program she was going to build, the 6 neighborhoods, the scale of it. She thought about what it took to design something that actually worked from the inside out rather than from the outside in, and about how the best designs were always the ones that took the actual conditions of the actual people seriously and built from there. She thought about a foundation that had been operating for 6 years and had $4 million in annual grants, and a director with 30 years of experience who had written a paper Adaiz had read in a graduate seminar. She thought about the man who had suggested she might be worth talking to without telling her it was his foundation. She thought about a lot of things. She got off at her stop. She walked home. She made dinner and called her mother in Atlanta and said, "Ma, I have some news." Her mother listened. When Adaiz was done, her mother said, "You sound like yourself." Adaiz said, "I am myself." Her mother said, "Good. That's always been enough." She hung up and sat in her Inwood apartment with the inconsistent heat doing its best, and Gerald's building making its familiar sounds around her, and the particular feeling of being, right now, precisely where she was supposed to be, which was not something she had always felt, and which she therefore recognized when it arrived. She took the job. The offer came on Friday. She accepted it the same day. She did not second-guess it. She was going to do good work. She was going to do it because it was the right thing to do, and because she was built for it, and because there were people in 6 neighborhoods who needed it, and that had always been, from the very first day of her first year at Cunny, the only reason she needed. The rest of it, the red light, the diner, the corridor, the careful distinction, the man who missed nothing and said exactly what he meant, and stopped at a corner in the rain because the situation required it. All of that was something she was going to understand in its own time, in the layers and at the pace that honest understanding required. She wasn't in a hurry. She had work to do first. And she had learned, from her mother and from Dorothy and from 3 years of training and 8 months of the real thing, that the work was always the right place to start. Her first week at the Park Foundation was the kind of week that told you everything about whether a place was real. She arrived Monday at 8:50. Grace Yoon arrived at 8:45. The staff was in before 9. The coffee was made by whoever got there first, which on Monday was a young man named Trevor, who was 23 and had grown up in Washington Heights, and had the specific quality of someone who had decided to be excellent before anyone told him he should be. He handed her a coffee without being asked and said, "I looked up your previous work, the case clustering methodology you used at the Bronx nonprofit. We've been trying to figure out how to adapt something like that for the Foundation's intake data. I have some questions when you have time." She said, "I have time at 2. He said, "I'll be there." That was the tone of the place. Direct, substantive. People who were there because the work was real and who expected you to be there for the same reason. She spent the first 3 days in the data. The Foundation had 6 years of program records across the target neighborhoods. Housing placements, intervention outcomes, recurring barriers, the places where the system consistently broke down. She read all of it. She made notes. She built a map of what was working and what was working less well, and where the gaps were that nobody had named yet, because the gaps were the kind that only became visible when you looked at the full picture, rather than the individual programs. On Thursday of the first week, Grace came into her office and said, "What are you finding?" Adaiz said, "You have a transition gap between emergency placement and permanent housing. People are stable for 30 days and then the support structure drops off and 38% cycle back into crisis within 6 months. The data is clear, but it's in 3 separate reports that nobody seems to have read together." Grace looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I've been trying to articulate that problem for 2 years. Adaiz said, "The articulation is the easy part. The program designed to address it is harder." Grace said, "That's why you're here." She went back to work. She saw Il-sung twice in the first month. Both times briefly, both times in the building, both times with the quality of 2 people who had an understanding about the nature of things and were honoring it. The first time he asked how the orientation was going, she said, well. The second time she passed him in the main corridor with a stack of program documents, and he looked at the stack and said, the transition gap? She stopped walking. She looked at him. How do you know about that? Grace mentioned it, he said. She was pleased. Adaizi looked at him for a moment. He was in a dark coat over a dark shirt, the tattoos at his neck visible above the collar, the same quality of complete and unperformative attention that she had first registered from a car window on a rainy night in November. She had thought, in the weeks since, that perhaps she had overestimated that quality in the original context, the way you sometimes did with people encountered in extreme moments. She had not overestimated it. She said, tell Grace I said thank you. He said, tell her yourself. She'd prefer it. She almost smiled. Almost. She told Grace herself. Grace said, you're doing good work. That's the thanks. The program design took 11 weeks. She worked with Trevor and 2 community liaisons, and a data analyst named Rosa, who had the specific gift of finding the thing in the numbers that the numbers weren't saying directly. They built a transitional support model that extended active case management through the 90-day post-placement window, the precise period where the data showed the highest rate of return to crisis. They built it from the actual patterns in the Foundation's 6 years of records. They built it from interviews with 34 people who had been through the existing programs and could say from the inside what had worked and what had left them standing in the rain. When she presented the model to the Foundation's program committee at the end of the 11 weeks, she stood at the front of the room and talked for 50 minutes and answered questions for 30 more, and at the end of it, Grace said simply, we're implementing this in Q2. Il-sung was at the back of the room. He had been there the entire time. She had known, and she had focused on the work, because the work was what she was there to do. Afterward, when the room had mostly cleared, he came to where she was gathering her materials and said, that was thorough, she said. It should be. People are depending on it being thorough. He said, yes. He paused. You built something real. She looked at him. He was not performing the comment. He was stating it the way he stated things that were true. She said, that's what I came here to do. He said, I know. The room was quiet. The afternoon light came through the windows of the Foundation's meeting room, with the specific quality of a December afternoon in Upper Manhattan, low and clear and honest. She thought about what she knew now and what she had not known on the night of the red light. She knew the shape of his world more clearly now, 6 weeks in, from the way the staff navigated certain conversations and the way Grace had said, carefully, on Adaizi's second week, that Il-sung built things that lasted and expected the same from the people around him, and that he operated with a code that was not always the city's code, but was his own, and that he held to it absolutely. She understood what that meant. She had grown up in a city that had many codes running simultaneously, and she had spent her professional life working in the spaces where those codes intersected, and she knew how to read the map. She said, I want to ask you something. He said, all right, she said. Why a foundation? Why this work specifically? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I grew up in a neighborhood in Seoul where housing was the thing that determined everything else. Whether children stayed in school, whether families held together, whether people had enough stability to make decisions about their lives, or whether every decision was just about getting through the next 30 days. I watched it from both sides. He paused. This is one of the things I can do about it. She absorbed that. Both sides, she said. Yes, he said. She nodded. She understood both sides. She had worked with people on both sides. She had her own thoughts about that, about the complexity of it, and those thoughts were not resolved, and she was not going to pretend they were. She said, the work is real. Whatever else is true, the work is real. He said, that's the only part I've ever cared about being right. She looked at him. He looked at her. The December light sat between them with the same quality it always had, unsparing and clear. She said, I'll see you Thursday. Program committee follow-up. He said, I'll be there. She picked up her documents and walked out of the meeting room and down the corridor and out into the December cold of Upper Manhattan. And she walked to the subway thinking about architecture and foundations and the specific quality of things built from honest materials, and about how you learned to tell the difference between what was built to last and what was built to look like it would. She thought about a red light on Amsterdam Avenue, about a diner that smelled like coffee and warmth, about Dorothy's voice saying, "I'm coming, baby," about showing up for people in the moment they needed it, a principle with no exceptions, simply how the work worked. She had work to do. The scale of it now matched what she had always believed she was capable of, and the foundation beneath it was solid. That was enough to build on.